Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sport all around the world. My name is Gianni, and for this second episode, we focus on the role of sports in political communication, and more specifically, on the current Trump administration. As we all know, the US is one of the major sports hubs in the world, and next summer, the country is organizing the most prestigious of competitions, the FIFA World Cup, alongside its Canadian and Mexican neighbors. To explore this theme, I'm joined today by journalist and researcher Karim Zidan, whose work focuses on the intersection between sport, politics, and power. Over the years, he has documented these dynamics across different regions and contexts, and his reports have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Play the Game, among others. Let's break it down. So first, Karim, thanks for joining me for today's episode. Before we dive in, I would love for listeners to hear about you in your own words. How would you introduce Karim Zidan?
I've had to do this more often lately, and it feels like I'm sort of building some sort of myth now about myself and the story of how I got into sports and politics. But it begins with, in school, I studied in university, I studied sports, and actually I didn't study sports, I studied the politics and economics. So really no necessary easy pathway towards the world of sports, but I wasn't particularly interested very much in what I was doing at the time. I mean, I did well in school, graduated with honors and everything, but while I was there, I started this blog, a mixed martial arts blog. At the time, the sport was really kicking off. This is like 2010, 2011, really becoming a very popular sport. And I just started writing about the sport. What I really wanted to do was to be a writer. That's I knew. Whether it was a journalist or whatever, I just wanted to write for a living. And eventually, I decided, well, my easiest pathway to becoming a writer was going to be through the world of sports. So I focused on setting up this blog and building it, and eventually it did get bigger and I got more attention and recognition. Eventually, while I was still in university, I was signed to my very first full-time position, basically, as a writer on a mixed martial arts website called Bloody Elbow. And this website was quite an intrepid website, despite its name. That was known for its very good investigative reporting on the sort of dark aspects of the sport, the corruption that's taking place in the sport, the issues of violence, and all sorts of different things like that. And I just jumped straight into the fray, and that was the kind of thing that I was trying to do, was sort of build on this narrative of, okay, what's going on behind the scenes, what's going on outside of the cage and outside of the ring when it comes to combat sports. Honestly, I think I had graduated from university in November, and then by December, I had gotten an opportunity to go travel to Russia. I was interviewing this Russian oligarch who owned a combat sports organization called M1 Global. And during the interview, he decided that I have a great voice, and he offered me this position as a commentator for M1 Global to do their English commentary. Now, again, I was just 22 years old or something like that at the time, and thought to myself, well, how often do you get opportunities like this to just travel to Russia? So I accepted, and I started going back and forth to Russia regularly for about 2 years, from say late 2014 till late-ish 2016. And during that time, I built a wide network of sources, learned so much about what was happening behind the scenes in the mixed martial arts landscape in Russia. Who were the people involved? I mean, I hung out with oligarchs, ex-KGB agents, things like that, things you wouldn't really expect to see, but that was the world I occupied for a little while. And eventually I decided, there's a lot of stuff happening here that nobody's talking about, nobody's writing about, and I could really make a name for myself doing this kind of reporting. And that's what I started doing. I started writing about sort of the dark underbelly, let's say, of combat sports and of the political landscape in Russia, and how oligarchs were utilizing things like combat sports to ingratiate themselves to Putin, who himself used combat sports to present himself as a strongman and a macho figure, right? And beyond just combat sports, he was known for his, let's call it masculine propaganda. You know, him shirtless riding a horse, all these different images of Putin. Combat sports was part of the propaganda for him, and people understood that a way to ingratiate yourself to Putin, to play the diplomacy game with Putin, was to show them that you're a tough guy as well. And what better way to be a tough guy than to, sponsor fighters or host fights? So the whole world was politically charged from the very beginning. And one of the most politically charged characters that I ended up writing about was the Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov. Now, Kadyrov was, let's call it my first big story, because as I'm in Russia, and it's the timing that matters here, right? This is why this story has sort of taken on a life of its own, is because I happen to be in Russia at the same time Ramzan Kadyrov decides that he himself wants to start an MMA organization, a mixed martial arts organization, and to take up the sport. So again, you've got this other world leader, this other sort of warlord who has this penchant for mixed martial arts, and he uses the sport sort of to present this image of himself as a, benign, magnanimous world leader who just happens to love combat sports and wants to support the sport. When the truth is that that wasn't exactly the case. What he was really doing was utilizing mixed martial arts as a means for sports socialization, to re-socialize his population, to build his own brand, and of course distract from the many human rights violations taking place in Chechnya at the time, which included purging the countries or the republic in Russia's LGBTQ plus community. Like they were going out and just absolutely, and I ended up getting to know some of these, let's call them victims in this scenario. And the stories that I heard were just horrific. And it became very clear to me that I was no longer just, at a strange intersection where the stories were a little absurd and you had warlords who thought that they could become fight promoters. No, but this was a bigger story now. This now included elements of geopolitics that I never thought I'd be writing about as somebody who was writing about combat sports. You have to understand, if I'm writing about, fights and what's happening in a cage in this popular sport, I'm not expecting in the end to try and tell a story to my readers about how a warlord in Chechnya, was using combat sports as a means to re-socialize and enhance the masculinity of his population, while at the same time, in contrast, was purging the country's gay people. So it's sort of a image I never really thought I would be presenting to the world, this contrast between, promoting mixed martial arts but killing gay people, right? And it's this discussion of masculinity became such a big proponent of this, and I started seeing it elsewhere in the world, and it became a big topic of my reporting. What was Jair Bolsonaro doing in Brazil with jiu-jitsu athletes, right? Like, what was Putin doing around mixed martial arts athletes, right? What was Donald Trump and the UFC's relationship? This has become sort of a all-encompassing global story, which is why I'm actually writing a book about my adventures over the last 10 years, including what I've done in Russia, plus this sort of decades worth of reporting that I've been doing.
We're gonna talk about Donald Trump and his propaganda in a bit, but first, with the World Cup drawouts, I have to ask you, as an Egyptian, how do you feel about your group? Are you confident or already started calculating the survival scenarios? I don't know if you're really into football.
I am. Football is this, if let's say if combat sports is my work, for the most part, then football is what brought me a lot more joy. And definitely as an Egyptian, it's the sport that, you grow up watching. My favorite team remains Al Ahly in Egypt.
Yeah, what about team to mine in Africa? I'm a runner, by the way.
There you go. So, you see, we both represent, I guess, very historic teams in Africa, right? So, football is such an important sport. And the Egyptian national, there's a reason I said my favorite team is Al Ahly, because Al Ahly has proven itself time and time again across Africa and in the Champions League, etc. A very renowned and successful team on the continent.
The biggest
Egypt, however,
to be honest.
Egypt, however, I mean, it has not been as impressive. Sure, we do very well when it comes to the African Cup of Nations, which we haven't won in a long time still, but we've performed better than any other team has in that tournament. But otherwise, Egypt just chokes in general, unfortunately. And that includes in the World Cup, which we barely ever get to appear in. We've still never won a World Cup game
Yeah.
ever in Egypt's history, right? Like, I mean, this is not like Morocco, I'm going on a historic World Cup run in 2022, right?
We can say that it's the total opposite between Morocco and Egypt when it comes
Exactly.
to the dynamic. Because in Africa we're not that good, but in the
Hmm.
World Cup on the global stage, we more or less do good figure, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
So
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, Morocco represented the rest of, the Arab and African world, I think, at the last World Cup, and we're very proud to see what had happened at that tournament. But I wish, like, a part of me was always wishing that, could this have been Egypt? And I just don't know if that team was ever there. We've got phenomenal players. We've got Mohamed Salah. We've got Omar Marmoush. Like, we've got players who should shine a lot more. But I don't know what it is. I'm hoping it will be better this time around. I think the group we're in presents an opportunity for us to win some games and to move on to the next round. It helps that it's a bigger tournament, and in some groups the top three will go through rather than
yeah.
just the top two. So I think we'll have more opportunities, but given our last appearance in 2018, how badly we did. I mean, we first survived a game against Uruguay. We lose to Russia, which fine, host nation, but then to lose to Saudi Arabia.
Mm,
It's been how long has it been? It's been 7 years now. It still hurts.
mm.
It still
By the
bothers
way,
me that we lost to Saudi.
Morocco is playing Saudi right now in the Arab.
Right now in the Arab Cup.
Yeah, in the Arab Cup. When we're gonna finish the meeting, I'm gonna go watch the second half. But yeah,
Yeah,
so
same here.
still on the draw. We also saw President Trump receiving the FIFA Peace Prize, which is, I quote, an award to recognize exceptional actions for peace and unity. This nomination did not exactly come as a surprise, but I'm curious, how did you interpret that moment in the ceremony?
Oh, I mean, it is yet another example of FIFA's propagandistic nature at this point. It's has ingratiated itself so embarrassingly to these autocrats around the world, and just the latest iteration of that is Donald Trump. FIFA, in a way, in a sense, I'd say this is a betrayal to football and to the ethos of world football and what it represents. But at the same time, there's a part of me that wants to say this was a cunning play by FIFA and by Infantino. Why? Because they proved something so simple, which is it doesn't take much to win over Donald Trump. All you have to do is stroke his ego. And if Donald Trump can't win the actual Nobel Peace Prize, let's invent a peace prize to give him. And he himself called it one of the great honors of his life to receive this prize. It's a bit ridiculous when you think about it across the spectrum here. But at the end of the day, this shows you just how much FIFA is willing to bend over backwards to work with these leaders. But it does so under the guise of unity in football, and that football itself will bring peace. I think these are incorrect concepts. Now, I'm not here to say that football doesn't bring joy, doesn't unify people, doesn't, bring your country together sometimes for a few days. But these are effervescent, ephemeral, momentary things. They're temporary. They don't bring permanent change. Have you ever seen a football game end the war? Like, that's not how this works. That's not how the world works. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we romanticize football to the level that we say it can solve problems. That's not true. On an individual level, football is brilliant at building community, at building your own confidence. Sports in general are a wonderful thing to participate in on an individual or a community level. But on a national level, the idea that we can just change countries or bring things together or use it as a means of legitimate diplomacy, I don't buy into that. Yet this is the entire ethos of FIFA and what they're trying to do now. But the problem is that as they say they're unifying the world, the only people they are actually working with are autocrats and dictators.
So one last question about the draw. Some time ago, FIFA President Gianni Infantino described the 2026 World Cup as I quote again, the greatest and most inclusive World Cup ever. Now, we're not here to debate whether it will actually be the greatest World Cup. That's another conversation. But when you look at the Iranian delegation's boycott and at some of the recent regulations introduced by the Trump administration affecting citizens from parts of the global south, such as Haiti, for example, do you think there are already early signs that raise questions about how inclusive this World Cup can actually be?
I mean, I think it's already a guarantee that this is now going to be the world's most inclusive World Cup. You know what's ironic, actually, is that this is going to be less inclusive than the last World Cup in Qatar. Here's why I say this, right? This is actually not that controversial a statement when you think about it. The World Cup in Qatar was extremely accessible to a portion of the world that would never have gotten visas into North America to begin with, right? It was affordable, was the other thing. So more people from across various classes and spectrums will be able to attend the World Cup. That is simply not the case in the United States. You've got, or just, sorry, North America in general. This applies to Canada and Mexico as well. Not only do you have to now afford the plane ticket across the world, which plane tickets are expensive, you've got to afford the ticket into the World Cup game, which are, I've never seen prices like this in my life for World Cup games. I mean, they used to be like, what, $30 to get into the World Cup? It's now $1,000 just to find a random seat at the back of the stadium in Vancouver, of all places. Like, none of this makes sense. Third of all, you have to contend with the fact that good luck trying to get a visa. On those factors alone, how can you possibly call this the most inclusive World Cup? Now, that doesn't even include the sort of protectionist policies implemented by the United States or even Canada, which has long made it difficult for people to acquire visas to begin with. And I don't see a fast-track system that's going to really work very well here. So it's not like you're going to be getting into Canada very easily either. I say this as I have cousins in Egypt who still haven't been able to visit me because Canada won't give them a visa. So why am I to expect that suddenly they'll be allowed to come in to watch a football game when those football game tickets have already been sold? The tickets are sold out. So what's the incentive now to bring more people into the country? Donald Trump is going under the same logic, hoping that he can present in this big showcase. And I think sort of the spectacle of the draw suggests what type of flavor the World Cup itself is going to have. All these shows, unbelievable amounts of celebrities. I mean, it's exactly what you'd expect of America. But it's the most problematic thing, I think, right now is that it's not just, this World Cup is not only non-inclusive to an international audience, but it is non-inclusive to its own domestic audience in the United States. Like, at least in Canada, if you're a Canadian, if you're a resident here, if you're on a visa and you're here in the country, you can maneuver freely. In the United States, you can basically get arrested by immigration agents while watching a football game, which, by the way, this is not hyperbole. This is something that actually happened at the Club World Cup final, where a father goes with his kids to attend the game and gets picked up by ICE in the end. This is just standard policy in the United States right now. So the idea that FIFA and the World Cup is just going to suddenly come and unify just Americans, let's not even talk about the world, unify Americans is, I'm sorry to say it, absolute bullshit.
So, in your latest article featured on your newsletter Sports Politica, you explained how Trump has positioned himself around the 2026 World Cup, something that we already noticed during the Club World Cup last year when he stole the spotlight from Chelsea players during the award ceremony. What does this tell us about how he wants to use major sporting events during his presidency?
I think Donald Trump is maybe the shrewdest American president yet when it comes to his utilization of sports overall. We have seen American presidents historically, sort of associate themselves with sports. We've seen Obama during his campaign, his first campaign for presidency, all the way back in 2008. There were always these videos of him, participating in basketball pickup games and stuff like that, which gave him this youthful image that resonated with the young audience, right? And this entire population of sports-loving Americans who saw him, and then you see the old man John McCain on the other side, and it's a very significant contrast. You've always had, people like George W. Bush throwing out the first pitch at games, and this was very significant during 9/11. And you've had, teams visit the White House regularly. So this sort of diplomatic aspect to sports has always existed in the United States. But Donald Trump has taken that to an extreme we've never seen before and connected these sports very significantly with his MAGA movement, right? Like this is a person who takes his entire cabinet like an entourage and attends a UFC fight night. And while he's at these UFC events, is making deals on the sides, right? And it's incredible to see that what used to be the deal making of the golf courses, and that's something Donald Trump was also famous for, have now become deal making on the sides of, cages and fight nights. It's extraordinary behavior. And you see him attend things like the Super Bowl. It presents him as a more relatable world leader than previous presidents before him that are so sort of stuck in their political ways. Donald Trump has done such an incredible job of presenting himself as anything but a politician. He has sat down and had conversations about his favorite boxers. He talks about sports as somebody who clearly has a passion for sports. This is not something he's lying about. You know what I mean? Maybe his attachment to football is a joke because he really doesn't understand the sport, nor does he ever really think about the sport before this World Cup. But generally, we can say that this man is an authentic sports fan, and that comes across to most Americans who don't really care about politics and want somebody they can relate to. Unfortunately, the most relatable person they could find in politics was Donald Trump.
I was actually also very surprised to saw that the Peace Prize fed his ego to the point he called soccer football. And that he said we have to find a new name for American football. That was funny.
That was incredible. I mean, it's all you can't tell if this man is thinking before he says these things or what, but to so quickly demolish America's pastime, America's, I guess, national sport, and say we need to change its name just because he's finally hosting the World Cup and gets this prize from it. It's incredible. But when you think about Donald Trump's relationship to the NFL over the past few years, it starts to make a bit more sense. Remember, this was when he first took office in 2017. This was the sport he targeted because it was the sport that he said had too much social justice in it. It had Colin Kaepernick kneeling for police brutality at the time, right? And Donald Trump used the sport as sort of a target, saying, hey, if you are a true American, a MAGA person, you are not supporting this sport. You're supporting our sports like the UFC. And it became sort of this parallel world where the conservatives liked combat sports and the liberals were the ones following things like American football. And it became sort of a culture war dynamic. And that's how he utilized the sport. So it doesn't surprise me now that he's still sort of taking jabs at the NFL.
And in your recent work, you describe sports as one of the most effective communication tools used by the MAGA movement. What makes sport like so uniquely useful for this kind of political messaging? Like
So,
why sports exactly?
I mean, it doesn't even necessarily apply to an individual sport, but here's the thing. Think of let's jump away from America for a second and look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's purchase of Newcastle United was an incredible boon for the country. Why? Because they didn't just buy a team and get to, magnanimously say, hey, look, we're supporting this wonderful club and we're improving the results as we go along. But they sort of inherited legions and legions of loyal Newcastle fans that are now going to somewhat be Saudi Arabia fans, because if these Newcastle fans have been living with decades of sort of misery and disappointment for what their team was doing, suddenly they're on a winning streak. Well, of course, you're going to somewhat be excited about the country that helped you get there. And it softens your interpretation of Saudi Arabia. And suddenly you've won over these millions of fans who are deeply, deeply connected to this sport and to this team and to this passion. Sometimes it's a nostalgia built on your youth. Maybe you watch the sport with your grandparents who aren't here anymore, or your father, or anything like that, right? Like these memories, these core moments in your life, they matter and you hold on to them very tightly. And these authoritarians now are learning how to weaponize that. MAGA is no different. Sure, they might not necessarily be buying the sports, but by connecting themselves to these things that Americans cherish and treasure so much, they're absolutely connecting themselves to those movements and subtly bringing themselves closer to those people as well.
You also highlight the relationship between FIFA and the current US administration. How do you interpret that dynamic, and what does it reveal about FIFA's broader political strategy?
I think FIFA is a organization that operates much like a mafia. It's an extremely corrupt entity that has no qualms about working with the worst people as long as it lines their pockets and continues to give them the leverage required to maintain power, which they absolutely have. FIFA, through Infantino, has been gathering plenty of resources, has found new coffers, such as, money coming from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, from these different places that help align with Gianni Infantino's ambitions. And he can now push things like the FIFA Club World Cup. He was looking for biannual World Cup tournaments at some point, right? Like, he is trying to expand football at his rate, and he's found the alliances that work for him, right? And that comes at the expense of the actual football fans. It even comes at the expense of the football players themselves, who now have to play in a calendar that makes no sense. It's inhuman at this point, the amount that they have to play. So really, FIFA is there to bypass regulations as much as possible, to bypass bureaucracy as much as possible. And the best way to do something like that is to not work with the democracies, but to work with autocrats and authoritarians who will help them bypass those regulations. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. What we're seeing in the US is going to be even worse when it comes to Saudi Arabia in 2034.
You've written about how certain sports environments end up functioning almost like extensions of political rallies. So what factors make that possible, and how does it play out in practice?
So this is absolutely true. It has applied with various sports, but of course, based on my expertise, I can tell you that the sport that really has dominated this world is mixed martial arts. I would even go so far as to make the case that the UFC helped put Donald Trump back in the White House. They were an essential
I have a question on Dana White afterwards. But yeah.
All right. They were an essential component of Donald Trump's campaign overall. They helped platform him. They helped normalize sort of this resurgence of Donald Trump to its audience, and they maintain a grip on this key demographic, these 18 to 35-year-old apolitical young men, which made up a very significant chunk of Donald Trump's voting base. They had fighters campaigning for Donald Trump, and what better way to present yourself as a strong man than to have actual strong men, these fighters, say you're a badass, you know what I mean? So it helps build his own image at the time. Hell, even after the January 6th insurrection, when people didn't even want to think about Donald Trump there afterwards for a few weeks, you know where he was still welcome? At a UFC event, and that's what he did. He goes to these UFC shows, gets celebrated and cheered by the audience, and you at home get to think, oh man, this guy's still extremely popular. Even at his lowest moments, he can always rely on going to a UFC event and sort of basking in their adoration and reaping the propaganda gains that come from that. So yes, we're not actually even looking at it as operating similar to a political rally, but these are political rallies at this point.
I would like to touch on the role of key figures around Trump. You've written about people like Dana White and Gianni Infantino, who in different ways have provided platforms or visibility to the president. How do you see their influence operating? And to what extent do they contribute directly or indirectly to promoting his political agenda?
I'd say Dana White is extraordinarily direct, even more so than Infantino, who isn't necessarily pushing for specific domestic policies in the US, but you can tell he's trying to soften the process for FIFA. There's a selfish interest for Infantino. With Dana White, sure, aligning himself with Trump has benefited the UFC in that it sort of built this parallel conservative economy for the UFC that it now continues to sort of reap benefits from and guarantee an audience. But that's not really the end game here. Dana White himself has become extremely influential within the conservative segment of society, and at the same time through business elites and political elites as well, because he's become an ally of Trump that you can reach out through him to get to Trump's ear. An example of this is Mark Zuckerberg, who did not have a great relationship with with Donald Trump, and decided maybe if I go through Dana White, that's going to work. So he actually brings Dana White onto the board of directors at Meta, in the hopes that that would sort of present Zuckerberg as a MAGA-friendly person and help him regain sort of ties with Donald Trump. It's a work in process, but you see the sort of the role Dana White plays here as this MAGA intermediary between Trump and these people who have fallen to the wayside who are trying to gain favor with him again. So that's sort of the situation at the moment. So yeah, when it comes to Dana White, he's so absolutely obvious about it. I mean, this is a person who was campaigning for Donald Trump at the Republican National Convention multiple times, 3 times as a matter of fact. He's been on the campaign trail with him repeatedly. He is the person who introduced Trump to the podcasters who would help salvage Donald Trump's campaign, right? So Dana White is an essential, pivotal player in this entire story.
Finally, since this is called the Sports Governance Podcast, I would like to end with a more conceptual question. Karim, how would you define the term sports governance today?
It's a complicated question, I think. The problem lies with the fact that there are entities that are still operating in a world where we can have this concept of good governance. I've worked for one of them, for instance, played a game. Integrity in sports and this idea that there can be a unified understanding of regulation, how we approach sports with integrity and with morals, feels unfortunately romanticized as we're working in the Sisyphean sort of uphill battle trying to struggle against the rising tide of venture capitalist funds, destroying sports, billionaire owners, autocrats and dictators, corrupt entities and institutions. It feels like when we talk about good governance and how we should approach the sport, it feels now that we are relying on old concepts that presume the world to be democratic and for sports themselves to be democratic. And that's kind of the problem. The corruption now has gone simply beyond us catching a doping athlete at this point, or simply a corrupt individual within an organization. The organizations themselves are decrepit and corrupt now to the core. This includes something like FIFA. So how do you file an appeal to FIFA about its governance issues when FIFA is not going to even take that appeal seriously? It's this concept of us taking a knife to a gunfight. We need to reconceptualize how we resist this certain upsurge of corruption in sports across the board. And I don't think our understanding of governance right now or our utilization of it matches that. I don't think we're ready for the fight ahead.
What this conversation really shows is how specific actors shape the story around global sports. Whether it's President Trump and the US administration, or institutions like FIFA and Gianni Infantino. Each of them plays a part in how major events are presented or used in the public sphere. And when all of these interests collide around something as big as the World Cup, for instance, sports becomes more than a competition. It becomes a stage where political messaging, visibility, and power all come together. Understanding that mix is key if we want to make sense of what's happening behind the scenes. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. If you found this useful, make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn. You were listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Younes Firari. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.